smack dab center of the Keystone State, this is Lou Bryson with Seen Through a Glass, a podcast that's mostly about food and drink in central Pennsylvania. Welcome to episode 81, Prince Farrington, Central PA's most famous bootlegger. Central Pennsylvania's most famous bootlegger maybe isn't saying a lot. He's not really well known at all once you get more than about 40 miles from Lock Haven. But I started hearing about Prince Farrington from Penns Valley folks even before we bought the house in Millheim. And once they found out I was a whiskey guy, they couldn't wait to tell me that I'd have to find out about Prince Farrington, who made the best rye whiskey in Pennsylvania. I assumed at first they were talking about someone like Noah Eby, who had made rye whiskey at a legitimate distillery in Woodward around the turn of the 20th century. Actually, a branded Eby's whiskey jug in good condition just went for $4,000 at a local auction last month. But as I listened, I learned that Prince Farrington had been a moonshiner and bootlegger during Prohibition and afterward. Not a legit distiller at all, though he was finally considering that option when his hard living caught up with him and he died in a Williamsport hospital in 1956 of cirrhosis and diabetes. I also learned that Prince was Farrington's given name, that he'd had stills all through the area and paid farmers to make shine that he'd collect and sell over a wide territory, that he had famously big feet and wore his shoes loose. I don't make this stuff up, I just report it, and that there were, surprisingly, still a few bottles of Prince Farrington's whiskey around. And then I heard a recording of a song called Prince Farrington by Danville musician Van Wagner, a frequent Elk Creek Cafe performer. The song is from the perspective of one of the guys who ran shine for the bootlegger, floating raft loads down the Susquehanna by night. The song is available on Spotify or at vanwagnermusic.com, where you can find other songs by Van, who's a real central Pennsylvania treasure. He's got a CD release event coming up on June 4th at Elk Creek, actually, and maybe I'll see you there. Then I found two books about Prince Farrington by Guy Grable, a retired history teacher from Middleburg in Snyder County. Published by Sunbury Press, they are Prohibition's Prince and Prince and the Paupers. That's where I got most of the details you're about to hear about the man's life, and also some from a few old newspaper stories. Prince was in the papers a lot, mostly in connection with law enforcement, but not always. As Mr. Grable recounts, a sort of Robin Hood legend has grown up around him, as he was famously generous. I did try to get in touch with Mr. Grable, but we had a bit of a family emergency come up, and I had no time to follow up with that, so there is no interview this time. There were a few other people who knew bits and pieces, like Ty Russell, whose great-grandfather is the paraphrased narrator of Wagner's song. There was a recent Facebook post about Farrington that brought dozens of comments from people who remembered that their grandparents knew him, made or ran shine for him, even a couple who claimed to be related. But no one seemed to know more than a few bits. So I stitched things together from what I had, leaning heavily on Mr. Grable's books. But this episode, it's just me and you, some wild history, and a description of what moonshine really was, and is, and how it's made. So let's start with a little moonshine of our own. Here's what I'm drinking today. Now, what I'm drinking today, of course, is not actually moonshine, although I do have some. It's a new sample of Michter's I just got. It's a new expression for them, a barrel-strength bottling of their US-1 Kentucky Sour Mash whiskey. We haven't tasted the sour mash on Seen Through a Glass yet. It's a whiskey that's made with a mash bill that doesn't hit the minimum 51% corn for bourbon or 51% rye for rye whiskey. It is, by the regs, simply whiskey. And this batch, 26D0898, is bottled at 111.2 proof. Like the other US-1 bottlings, it is labeled without an age statement. Let's have a taste. Nice color to it. And a nice smell. This is going to sound kind of stupid, but it's got a real American whiskey nose. There's some spicy hard candy there, a real sweetness, some vanilla, caramel, toffee notes from the oak, and Wow, like a bright berry note to it. It's got a lot going on there. Let's try some. Wow, all that comes through, plus some really good cereal notes. Oh my God, the legs on this are amazing. This really just streaks down the glass. Wow. There is a lot in this whiskey. This is a delightful mouthful. And it's okay, it's $120. Now, that sounds like a lot, and that's about as much as I've ever paid for a bottle of whiskey, but these days, that's not terrible, especially for barrel proof and Michters. Wow, that's good. I could easily just keep going on that. It is sweet, but at the same time, it has a lot of good complexity. Nothing's really overpowering. That's pretty good whiskey. All right, let's get to your smack dab in the center, sponsored by the Happy Valley Adventure Bureau. If we're talking about moonshine, it's only right that we should talk about the two great distilleries here in Happy Valley, Big Spring and Barrel 21. Bellefonte is home to Big Spring Spirits, and if, like everyone else, you keep saying Big Springs, here's a handy way to remember. There's one spring, but many spirits. They're in the old Match Factory building. Walk back to their beautiful tasting room and have some crafty cocktails from their seasonally changing menu. There's open mic Sunday afternoons, trivia on Thursdays, Taco Tuesdays. There's always something. Is Bellefonte too far from where you are? Hey, Big Spring now has a cocktail bar in State College in the Scholar Hotel on Beaver Avenue. Now, out on the northwest side of State College is where you'll find Barrel 21, across the parking lot from Otto's Brew Pub. Barrel 21 has a wide array of spirits, including rye whiskey, bourbon, rock and rye, and one of the few buckwheat whiskeys you'll find anywhere in the world. Their cocktail program is outstanding, and there's a full menu. Barrel 21's even out in Penns Valley. Their new Stillhouse satellite in Spring Mills has a wild hot dog menu, great Otto's beers, and a growing cocktail list. Lift your spirits. Go to the happyvalley.com website, click on the Eat and Sip button, and you'll find both of these great distilleries. Cheers! Okay, here's how this story starts. Prince Farrington was born in 1889 in Guilford County, North Carolina, to Tom and Beverly Farrington. Tom was a farmer and had a small licensed distillery, but he apparently also made some extra bottles and barrels that he maybe forgot to tell the government tax agents about. A not uncommon practice. And the apple would not fall far from the tree. Prince was born prematurely, but thanks to the advice and care of the family doctor, Dr. Prince, the boy survived. A grateful family named him after the doctor. He would be Prince David Farrington. So how did a North Carolina mountain boy wind up in Pennsylvania? Well, Prince and his young family came to Sugar Valley in 1921, drawn by a friend's description of the area as rich with pure water and plentiful corn crops and the kind of deep private gaps and ravines that moonshiners love to settle in. That friend, Jim Wilson, had grown up in Salona, Pennsylvania, just south of Mill Hall, where Big Fishing Creek runs through Axe Factory Hollow. Hey, the Mann brothers strike again! Farrington had met Wilson in the late 19-teens in North Carolina when they were in adjoining cells in a state prison. Farrington was doing time for moonshining, Wilson for smuggling weed from Cuba. And this was not Farrington's first time in jail either. In 1905, at the age of 15, he was arrested, along with his father, brother, and a friend, for torching a neighbor's barn in retaliation for the neighbor ratting them out as moonshiners. The friend turned state's evidence, and though his father was found innocent, Prince and his brother were sentenced to 5 years on the prison road gang. He served 9 months, and by the time he met Jim Wilson, he'd been in at least 2 other jails, including a stretch in federal prison, all for moonshine offenses. He'd also managed to get married to Martha White. They would have what was, by all accounts, a tempestuous marriage, but they also raised 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. Martha, who everyone called Maddie, would divorce Prince in 1930, But they continued to run the business together and live together, and at the end, they ran from the law together. The fact of their divorce would actually come as a surprise to friends and even family years after it had happened. Back in 1921, though, the Farringtons had loaded themselves and their stuff into a friend's Ford automobile and made the trek north. They settled in the Loganton area in Sugar Valley, which is watered by Fishing Creek. Prince bought an orchard of apple and peach trees called the Florida Fruit Farm. He immediately bought equipment and ingredients to start making liquor, and it was what he knew. In less than a year, in the spring of 1922, the Florida Fruit Farm was raided by federal Prohibition agents, who seized 2 stills, 22 barrels of whiskey, averaging about 35 gallons each, bottles and labels, and a number of firearms. But they didn't get Prince Farrington. He wasn't there. Likely he was down in North Carolina, peddling his wares to the customers he knew best. The Farringtons recovered quickly from the raid, and in 1926 bought another farm in Auntie's Fort near the Susquehanna River. They would stay there for most of the rest of his life. At this point, Farrington was beginning to develop the cooperative web that would enable him to build his moonshine empire in Clinton and Lycoming counties. He was, as Guy Grable called him, a human vortex, sucking people into his circles. This wasn't just one family with a still. Grable identified at least 30 sites where Farrington either ran a still or set someone else up with a still to make whiskey for him. Some of the stills he made himself. He had a reputation as a crafty hand with a soldering iron. But as one old fellow is quoted in Grable's book, any tinner, a tinsmith, could run a still up in pretty short order for about $5. It's not cheap in 1926, but it wasn't bad either, and Prince always had cash to loan or give. In fact, Farrington had a reputation that is still recalled today for being pretty free with his money. He would buy kids toys and pocket knives and sweets, buy food for families, and he always had a nice car that he would loan freely. And he liked being liked, but it was also, at least to some extent, a calculation. For instance, when he bought corn to make whiskey or apples to make brandy, he always paid top dollar and usually a little more on top of that. And then maybe the farmer would let a still run on his land, or maybe open his barn door to hide a load of hooch, or even let Prince himself hole up for a few days in those times when the law was looking for him. And during these days of Prohibition, there were agents in Sugar Valley all the time, looking for the Prince, which is probably why Farrington started moving his operations farther out into the deeper ravines and thicker woods of northern Clinton County. As trucks got more capable and his market grew, he could afford to move the operations farther away and supply them and pick up the goods. We may wonder today why so much illicit liquor was being made. Well, there's an idea called the Iron Law of Prohibition, which notes that when law enforcement of prohibition, of whatever, alcohol, drugs, tobacco, becomes more intense, the potency of the prohibited substances increases. It's the same idea behind why 18th century farmers would turn their crops into liquor. It's easier to transport 1 mule load of whiskey than 8 mule loads of corn. Similarly, if the cops are looking for you, transporting and hiding 10 cases of liquor is easier and safer than, say, 40 cases of wine or a whole truckload of beer. Moonshine just made sense. And it was profitable, too. It wasn't just that there was no legal competition during Prohibition, and people would pay what they had to for their daily drink. Farrington continued to make shine into the 1940s. It's because making a gallon of his whiskey cost about 50 cents, and he could sell it for $10. And not 1 penny of that went to government taxes, although some did go into the pockets of government officials. He got even more for the fewer barrels of apple and peach brandy he'd make. The scarcity and perceived fancy quality of the fruit booze brought a higher price. I said I'd tell you how it was made, and if you want the whole thing laid out in one book, you should get my good friend Matthew Rowley's book called Moonshine. He went out in the woods to do the research, had some great stories about it. There are places where moonshine is more disreputable than just about anything, and people still make it and buy it. Matthew's book will not only tell you stories and history of moonshine, but he also has recipes and pretty detailed instructions on how to fabricate your own still. And before I go into any more details, it seems like a good time to remind you that despite a couple of recent court rulings, home distilling is still considered illegal in the United States, subject to a fine of up to $10,000 and up to 5 years in jail. Now, that may well all go away, and soon, but for now, those are the stakes. To be honest, plenty of people take that challenge because there just isn't that much enforcement these days. But distillation is also inherently dangerous, much more so than brewing. Alcohol vapor is flammable to the point of being explosive, and a distiller did die at a commercial craft distillery in Kentucky in 2015. So stay safe. Anyway, a moonshiner in the 1920s did not have access to a lot of the tools and special grains and enzymes a modern-day distiller does. They had corn or fruit, they had cold water, and they had fire. So you'd set up your simple pot still near a stream. You needed water to mash, and you needed cool water for condensing the vapors. At the very simplest, you'd make cider from apples or peaches or pears. You'd let that ferment and then distill that. Corn was much cheaper and more plentiful, though, and could be processed to make a mash. They would fill a burlap sack with corn, loosely sew it up, and anchor it in a stream for a few days. The corn would sprout, releasing the enzymes that can turn starch to the sugars you need to ferment. Pull the sack up out of the water, pour the corn into a barrel, fill it up with hot water. The hot water triggers the enzymatic reaction that converts the starches to sugar, and you've got mash, distiller's beer. Once it cooled, they'd add yeast, either from a starter they would keep going, or caked yeast, or yeast from a bakery. Dried active yeast, the stuff we get in the little envelopes to make bread, that was just starting to become available, and it probably wasn't around Sugar Valley yet. So you let all that work a few days, bubbling away, and it would be fermented out and ready to pour into the still. The still might be a wide-bellied copper pot with a top you could remove to add the mash, seal it up, run it, and then take it out after your distill. Or at the larger operations, there may have been a bigger vessel with valves and portholes to clean out the still for the next batch. Generally, though, these stills were pretty simple. Once the still was charged with the mash or cider, you had to heat it. Most small stills back in the woods simply had a wood fire underneath them, carefully tended to keep the heat steady. But Prince Farrington was kind of modern. In 1983, the late Lester Seiler, who distilled for Farrington with his father Turbot Seiler, recorded an interview where, among other things, he said that Prince didn't use fire, but hand-built low-pressure boilers instead, and used steam to heat the stills. The steam heat was more uniform, and there was no chance of burning the mash in the still, which would ruin the taste of the batch and be a bear to clean out. This was quite an operation, and remember, this was going on in a couple dozen places at one time or another. As the mash cooked and the vapor started to come off the still, it would spiral down through a coiled copper line, the worm, that sat in a barrel of cold water. The water would be piped into the barrel from the nearby stream and slowly valved off at the bottom to keep the water cold enough to condense the vapors. These condensed spirits would come off the spout at the bottom of the worm, which would be poking out of the bottom of the barrel, and be caught in a glass jar. The first jar or two would be cloudy and sharp smelling, and they'd be thrown away, and then the good stuff would start to flow. Now, we don't know what the precise recipe of Farrington's whiskey was. He kept those cards pretty close to his chest and made sure no one else wrote anything down. He definitely made corn whiskey and fruit brandies. Grable's book has a picture of a bottle of what may have been Farrington whiskey with a label that says old-fashioned Pennsylvania rye whiskey, but that may have just been like the way some Canadian whiskey is still called rye, even when it contains none of the grain. Maybe, but we don't know. But we do know that they were experienced practical distillers and made quality whiskey, because Seiler also talked about what Farrington called the back ends. After the main run of spirit, the hearts, came off the worm, the run would start to smell different, and this is what we call the tails or feints, and Seiler noted that they smelled kind of wooden-like. They called them the back ends because they'd save them, and when they had enough, they'd put them back in the still to distill them again. Modern distillers do the same thing with the tails or feints, because there's still good alcohol in there, and you want every penny you can wring out of it. Was Prince Farrington's whiskey aged, or just white lightning? The truth is, I don't know, and Mr. Grable doesn't say. That photo of the juice, it's a half-empty bottle shown in Grable's second book, Prince and the Paupers, and it looks like clear, unaged spirit. Prince Farrington is notable for being the biggest bootlegger in central Pennsylvania. His business kept the area together in the 20s and into the Great Depression. The Depression didn't really touch us in the valley, one farmer said, noted Farrington's cash business for keeping the things solvent. But when the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board enforcement agents took Farrington in a raid in August of '46, out near the old lumber town of Eagleton, north of Lock Haven, it was finally the end of the line for the old moonshiner. The still setup was one of Farrington's largest, with a generator for electric lights, a coal-fired boiler, and a supply of over 1,000-gallon containers waiting to be filled. The operation was estimated to have cost about $10,000 to build. Farrington reportedly laid down and took a snooze as the agents destroyed the stills and barrels. He was packed in their truck and driven down to Lewisburg to be charged. After an indictment was handed down, a friend paid his $1,500 bail, but Prince Farrington never showed up at the trial. He was last seen in his old green pickup, heading down Fourth Gap Road over the mountain with Mattie at his side. Farrington stayed on the run for almost 3 years, and the FBI got involved because of the federal distilling charges and suspicions that he had crossed state lines. J. Edgar Hoover took a personal interest, and that pretty much sealed his fate. 2 FBI agents found him in March of 1951 at a fishing camp outside Orlando. He was in poor health, but he was unrepentantly making orange brandy. It was what he knew best. Found guilty, Prince Farrington did a year in the same Atlanta prison he'd inhabited 50 years earlier. He was released early because of his failing health and went back to Pennsylvania. As I mentioned earlier, he did consider buying the old Lock Haven brewery to go legit, but his health gave out before the old bootlegger could write what would have been a wonderful end to his career. Prince Farrington died in early June 1956 in a Williamsport hospital. Cause of death, liver failure from cirrhosis. Last week, I put the corgis in the Subaru and headed up over the ridges. We rolled into the west end of Lock Haven and headed up the West Branch. About 8 miles up the river, I turned away from the water and headed into the woods on Eagleton Road, a dirt track leading back up the ravines to the old Eagleton ghost town where Prince Farrington's last operation had been. It was a winding, dusty drive, though the first half of it was in great shape, and I passed several cars and trucks going the other way. But then the map directed me off onto a side road, and I was glad I had the extra ground clearance of the Outback. There was no one and nothing around, seclusion, and an easy choke point to watch for unwanted guests. Fresh water from Boiling Run and Hunter Run, or maybe the still had been further downhill on the Tangascootack Creek. When I got to the old Eagleton site, I turned off the engine, and we sat a bit. It was sunny, but cool, and as the engine ticked and pinged and the corgis panted, I could hear nothing else. We were in moonshine country, all alone, back a holler, with a crick and firewood. Now, I'm not going to tell you, well, I sure did understand Prince Farrington at that moment, because that would be bullshit. But I will say this. It made me think about something Thomas Earl Mackenzie told me, who's another guy like Prince Farrington, who distills despite the challenges, because it's just what he does best. I met Thomas Earl back in 2013, when he was the distiller for Finger Lakes Distilling up in Burdett, New York, overlooking Seneca Lake. Now, Thomas is from Alabama, but he said he felt completely at home in the Finger Lakes. It's all Appalachians, don't matter what state it is, he told me. Wherever you are, you got guys making whiskey in the woods. I'm sure there are guys out in the woods today, somewhere in central Pennsylvania, making whiskey. And in memory of Prince Farrington, I wish them luck. Here's an excerpt from An Ode to Prince Farrington, written by Lawrence Levin of Mill Hall, a retired professor of English at Lock Haven University. Prince Farrington stilled his whiskey in the Pennsylvania hills. Every mountain has its hollow, every hollow has its still. Prince Farrington stilled his whiskeys as smooth could be. You could ask anyone for miles around. Everyone would agree. And the whiskey's made for sippin' and making you feel whole. When you're drinking Prince Farrington's whiskey, it reaches and touches your soul. That's the show. My thanks to Guy Grable, if he's listening, for feeding my curiosity with a filling farrago of facts about Pennsylvania's king of the bootleggers, Prince Farrington. As always, you can find pictures for this episode on Instagram at Stag Podcast and on Facebook at Seen Through a Glass. If you're listening to the show on the radio at WSOV, there are over 80 more episodes to enjoy at Spotify or Apple Podcasts, Podbean, really any of the major podcast sources. Moonshine is an old Scots-English term for illegally made spirits, derived from them being made at night, by moonshine, to avoid detection by excise agents. The Irish call it poitín, and the lore is that it's always quite strong. There's that old iron law of Prohibition at work, and also useful as liniment for racehorses. The Germans call it Schwarzgebrannte, black distilled, done in the dark. Quebecois call it bagasse, and Newfoundlanders make a homemade rum they call screech. Both the Irish and the American hillbillies had another name for it, of course. When brothers Barney and Allie Hartman originally started bottling their lemon-lime soda pop in 1932, it was intended as a mixer or chaser for shine. And the Knoxville boys gave the world a wink and named it Mountain Dew. The next episode is once again kind of up in the air. I may well have to go on a short hiatus this summer to get the book done and my son married, but we're doing okay so far. So I'll see you back here in 2 weeks anyway. Probably. Until then, thanks for listening. This is Lou Bryson on Seen Through a Glass from the smack dab center of the Keystone State.